Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from Comcast, the Spencer family, Chevron, Community Health System, Harris Ranch Resort, Producers Dairy, Caleb and Desiree House, Valley Children's Health Care, and The Wonderful Company. Additional support provided by from the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's public universities. This is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Blake Zante.
Welcome to the Maddy Report. Today we're joined by a trusted speechwriter, confidant, and strategist to former U.S. Presidents Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon, Ken Khachigian. We'll discuss his time working between these two administrations and how American presidential politics has changed over the last several decades. Thank you again for joining us today, Ken. Really appreciate you being on the Maddy Report.
Thanks for having me.
Well, before we get into conversation, I want to talk about your book, Behind Closed Doors, In the Room with Reagan and Nixon. What motivated you to write this book, and what do you hope readers will take away or learn from it?
Well, first of all, I wanted to tell my story. I had an interesting career, fascinating career with the two presidents during the Cold War, and I just felt I had to tell this story. And there was a takeaway, a great takeaway during the history of the time I spent with the two presidents in the White House, and with President Nixon as he restored his life after Watergate in the Western White House. Nobody had told that story before. Nobody who had been with him during that period had told that story. Nobody who had traveled with President Reagan during the 80 campaign had written him from the inside. I'd kept diaries during that campaign, so there's fascinating stories. I kept incredible notes during all those times with the two presidents, and so there was a lot of history to be told, and so I wanted to tell that story. And it was also a memoir of my whole life during that period. And people had been telling me for years and years, why don't you write a book? And finally got around to doing it. In the meantime, I had most of my colleagues wrote their books right after they left the White House or left government, and I had to actually put food on the table, so I didn't have time to write a book. So finally, I got around to writing it back in 2019, and it took me 4.5 years to write it. So, and also, it's an important story to tell for young people who want to get a career in politics or in government, or who have an interest in politics, that they can do something starting from a very modest place in life and move up the ladder and achieve a very high level of place in their career.
Now let's talk about that a little bit. Before your work with Presidents Nixon and Reagan, how did you first become interested in politics, and what were some of the earliest jobs or roles that helped prepare you for a career in politics and speechwriting?
Well, I got interested in politics back in high school. There's, I think it still exists, something called Boy State, sponsored by the American Legion, where two young teenagers from each high school would go to Sacramento and be participating in mock government, and where you'd actually be members in two fake political parties, the Whigs and the Feds, as we called them, and run for state offices and participate in government. And so I actually ran for state in one position of state controller. And all from the time of junior high school, I ran for offices. And in high school, I was a class president. And in college, I was the student body president. So I was always interested in some kind of activity like that. And then in college, I was on the debate team, and then student body president at UCSB. And then on the debate team, when Richard Nixon was campaigning for governor in 1962, he was in Santa Barbara, and we went to meet with him. And then my roommate in college gave me a copy of Six Crises, and I got interested in Nixon. So all those things sort of conglomerated together. And then my mom, when we were young, she got us interested in, made sure we were interested in public affairs, and went to see Adlai Stevenson when he campaigned in Visalia, back in 1956, and she took me to see Jack Kennedy when he campaigned through the San Joaquin Valley on a whistle stop in 1960. And so we're always interested in public affairs and politics one way or the other.
Well, thank you. Up next, we'll be discussing Ken's time while working under the Nixon administration. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. Ken, I'd like to begin our conversation with you. Starting in the Nixon administration, you first became involved in national politics by volunteering on President Nixon's 1968 presidential campaign. What initially motivated you to get involved, and what was American politics like during this time period?
I got interested in followed President Nixon from college, and I saw that he was going to run for president in 1968, and he wasn't the favorite candidate back in those days. Romney and Rockefeller and even Ronald Reagan were the favorite candidates, and so I saw an interest that there might be an opportunity to volunteer. So I volunteered for his campaign, sent a letter to him, and got a response back from Pat Buchanan, who eventually became my mentor in the White House later on. And so I volunteered in his campaign, and it was an opportunity because there were very few people who were interested. Nixon was thought of as a has-been back in those days. And I started out as in the correspondence section at the very low level, volunteered to do whatever they asked me to do. And then Marty Anderson, who was at Hoover Institution, who was working as a domestic advisor at that time, saw that I was sort of an eager beaver and got me hooked up in the 68 campaign as a researcher. And so it got me involved, and it was, law school was pretty boring in the second year or so. Being involved in the campaign was really fascinating. And 1968 was a year of turmoil. It was the year of Martin Luther King's assassination, and Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, and there were a lot of riots across the country at the time, and there was a lot of disorder throughout the country. The Vietnam War was very controversial, and there were a lot of demonstrations across the country, so law and order was a big issue, and the Vietnam War was very contentious, and so the campaign was a very difficult campaign, and we had a third party. George Wallace was running as well. So being involved at that time was really fascinating for me because Alan Greenspan, who later had the Federal Reserve Board, was my I was a direct report to him. And so I got a chance at age 23 to have just a fascinating experience in that campaign right off the bat, working in my second year of law school, going back and forth working in the campaign full-time in the summer, and then led to a job in the White House.
Now, later on in the administration, from 1970 to 1974, you served as staff assistant and deputy assistant to President Nixon. You spoke about, sort of the time early on during the campaign, but recalling that time in America, what was it like working in the administration?
Well, predominantly what was dominated everything during that period from 70, especially through 73, was the Vietnam War, was very heavily involved. And of course, we were involved in the Cold War and the contention between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. So foreign policy dominated everything, although the Nixon administration had very many domestic achievements, the formation of the EPA and OSHA and many other things, and environmental, the desegregation of the southern schools and things like that. But foreign policy was very dominant. But the Vietnam War created a lot of contention, and that was very much on my desk throughout the time. And then in 1971 and early 72, then political affairs took a great part of my time working in preparation for the 72 campaign. So the 72 campaign became very much part of my desk duties. But through all that time, we had very much dissent and demonstrations throughout. There was 1971, we had May Day demonstrations in the Capitol. They tried to shut down the Capitol. In one part of the time in Washington, D.C., we had to surround the White House with buses to protect it from demonstrators. So it was quite, it was quite an exciting time in Washington at the time. But and then of course Watergate dominated from 1973 through 74. So I can tell you it was a pretty exciting time in Washington.
And you became a pretty close and personal confidant to President Nixon. How did that working relationship evolve, and what perspectives did you gain from working with him during his presidency?
Well, that evolved largely from the time of Watergate, largely because from 1973, when the impeachment efforts began, and up through 74, I turned out to become on the speechwriting staff for President Nixon, but eventually, when the impeachment proceedings started in 1974, they wanted me to take on the role of, because I was an attorney, a graduate of Columbia University, and I had my law degree. I wore also the hat of not only a writer, but a lawyer, as part of the impeachment defense team when I was going to go up on the Hill. So I was part of, that was a whole part of my portfolio at that time, was working on the impeachment defense of the president during Watergate for the last, pretty much the 5 to 6 months of his presidency, was dealing with that, because that was fully much on our plate. Although I was also working on the speechwriting staff, helping with his speeches as well. So it was, believe me, it was a busy time. It was 6 days a week. I worked every Saturday, was in the White House working.
Thank you. We'll be right back after this break. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back to the Maddy Report. Ken, thank you again for joining the program today. Ken Khachigian is joining us today. You joined President Reagan's 1980 presidential campaign and quickly became a trusted speechwriter and political strategist to President Reagan, preparing many of the president's speeches and addresses. How did you learn the president's voice when drafting his speeches, and how closely did you work with President Reagan on them?
Well, I'm going to circle back just for a moment. One of the reasons I was able to become close to President Reagan was because I became close to President Nixon in his post-presidency, and that was because of the work I did in his Watergate defense, and I became trusted to him. And when I came to San Clemente to help him, I sat at his knee for so many years, but he helped me learn a lot about President Reagan, because through those years with President Nixon, we spent a lot of time with studying President Reagan and his campaigns. And that's one of the interesting things about my book that I want people to read. One of the reasons I want them to read my book is that they don't know how closely President Nixon was with President Reagan in terms of his 1980 campaign, and how much I learned from President Nixon that I transferred to President Reagan. So you're asking me about how I learned about President Reagan. Is that some of that I learned from what President Nixon taught me about studying President Reagan. And that is to learn about how President Reagan used illustrations, about how he used storytelling, about learning how spending time learning his voice, how he used imagery, and it was a matter of not trying to be telling stories in the way I wanted to tell them as a speechwriter, but learning how Ronald Reagan wanted to tell the stories in his way. So the most important thing about being a speechwriter for Ronald Reagan was being Ronald Reagan and not being Ken Khachigian. So a lot of those things I actually learned from Richard Nixon. I say I got my PhD in politics and communication from Ronald Reagan, but I got my bachelor's and master's from Richard Nixon in how he helped me study not just politics, but also studied Ronald Reagan. And he became a very much important part of Ronald Reagan's 80 and 84 campaigns.
Now, you talked about how sort of your role evolved. You got your PhD in the Reagan administration. During the 1984 campaign, you took on expanded responsibilities as chief campaign speechwriter, senior advisor, and director of issues and research. How did your role evolve in that re-election effort compared to your work earlier in Reagan's presidency and also in Nixon's administration as well?
Well, in the '84 campaign, I took on many more responsibilities to oversee a lot of messaging and communications, and I wrote a lot of the commercials. And so the issues and research was to take on the responsibilities of like at the convention, and then but also doing when we did the Morning in America commercials and the campaign messaging, that devolved upon me to write a lot of the president's commercials, the talking head commercials, and to help develop with the pollsters the messaging for the entire campaign. And that's devolved upon the issues and research, and to research the Mondale campaign as well. So I had a staff of about 15 to 16 people that I had to work with throughout that campaign. So my duties expanded quite widely at that time.
Thank you. We're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back after this. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. Ken Khachigian, thanks again for joining us on the Maddy Report today. Before you go, I want to talk a little bit about how things have changed over time, as well as what are some of the key differences you perceive in the current political environment versus the administrations you worked in. Maybe starting off, how are political strategies different from the current administration and administrations that you've served in?
Well, for one thing, social media has taken over the scene so dramatically. It's such a different animal than it was back then, and I think that's the biggest difference that I can think of that has so dramatically changed the political scene in terms of how you approach politics. Political influencers have such a big impact on politics today. The other thing is that back in the 70s and 80s, the media that we were dealing with was, you had basically 3 networks, you had 2 wire services, you had 3 major news weeklies, you had 2 or 3 or 4 major dailies, newspapers that dominated the media in America. That has totally changed now, where you have cable news, you have social media, you have all the podcasts going back and forth, and you have individuals that can now have access on X, or what was formerly Twitter, that anybody can have influence, like I say, the influencers now. All that has changed so that politics and communication has totally impacted politics in a way that's so totally different in communication. The one thing that has stayed the same is a good message is a good message, and that still can change, and a single good message can change the dynamics of a campaign and cause the difference between victory and defeat.
Now, speaking about the institution of the American presidency as a whole, how have you seen it change or evolve over time? And have you seen our other branches of government change, for example, the legislative branch?
Well, I don't think the basic nature of American constitutional politics has not changed that much. It's the only difference I see is that I think the tone and language of politics has changed substantially back and forth. And in the legislature, I don't see, especially in our Congress, I don't see the kind of giants that I saw back in the time I was there, like Everett Dirksen, and on the Republican side, or a Carl Albert on the Democratic side, or a William Fulbright, or a Scoop Jackson on the Democratic side, or Bob Dole on the Republican side. I just don't. The dialogue is quite different. But the American constitutional process really tends to. It's very resilient. It will tend to survive, I think.
Speaking about this, and you sort of touched on it in your prior answer, but today we see a deep political divide and
Yes.
some increasing partisanship regarding many issues. In this environment, are the days of President Reagan and Tip O'Neill still possible, and can bipartisanship still be achieved, or does polarization make it very difficult to attain?
It's interesting because I think one of the things that I try to tell people that the notion of the camaraderie between Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan is somewhat mythological, by the way. Tip O'Neill and Reagan publicly had this sort of mythology of warring during the day and sipping a beer at night and patting each other on the shoulder and telling Irish stories. But Tip O'Neill had his knife out for Reagan at all times. And Reagan, despite what people see publicly, Reagan was a tough guy, and he was very combative, and he was really very, very competitive. And so I think it's healthy to have some combat, and we do have a lot of polarization, but a lot of that is fomented by the nature of our media today as well.
Ken Khachigian, a native of Visalia, California, and author of Behind Closed Doors, In the Room with Reagan and Nixon. Thank you for joining the Maddy Report today. Really appreciate you being on the program.
I hope they'll take a look at my book. So it's a very readable book, and it tells the inside story of what it's like in the White House, and it's something coming from Visalia. My mother was born at First, just off Shields, so we've come a long way from Fresno and Visalia.
Well, thank you again for joining the program. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you for tuning into the Maddy Report. To learn more about the Maddy Institute, visit themaddyinstitute.org. The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about today's episode of the Maddy Report, please visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.